Right. Okay. So Mem Vav Amid Aleph is where we're going to start. Of course, we bench Rosh Chodesh Elul. So this week, end of the week, Thursday, Friday is Elul, and we know what that means. Of course, I heard a little Dvar Torah over Shabbos, where someone was talking about the that from Tu B'Av in Europe and among many of the Gedolim, from Tu B'Av after Tu B'Av, there are many letters written between Gedolim, and the sign off is Ksiva v'Chasima Toiva, such and such. In other words, starting with Tu B'Av, after Tu B'Av, they already recognized that the winds of Elul and of Yom Nevar were coming, and they would write in their letters, which was, I mean, back in the day, Gedolim used to actually write prolifically one to the other, and they would sign it Ksiva v'Chasima Toiva. So, that already tells us where we are. And it's we still have a little bit of the summer left, but not far away is Elul and Kia Shofar and everything. So in any event, that's where we are. So Mem Vav Amid Aleph.
Excuse me, Rabbi, before you start, we probably ought to recognize that we need a refuah shlema for the Jews in Hawaii and Maui that some of them had to run into the water so as not to be burned up. The tremendous tragedy there.
I didn't know there was. Yeah, I didn't know whether there was Jews involved as well, but it doesn't matter. I mean, it's a terrible tragedy. What's going on over there, the fires. But if there are Yidden there, then of course that even for us, I mean, everybody has to pidyon nefesh. But I understand Hatzalah and others are gearing up to really go out there, and it's a big Kiddush Hashem that they jump out quickly to try to help the local populace.
Yeah.
Jews or not, it doesn't matter, but I didn't realize there were Jews involved. Okay. All right. So, Mem Vav Amid Aleph. So, we're about to start the Torah, which is about 4 lines from the bottom. But right before that, let's just quickly set the stage, because we had a very good discussion last week. Again, the subject is whether or not money can be used for chalipin, whether or not you can use money to do a kinyan chalipin. And it was a very, very interesting exchange back and forth, because many of the Moraim all said no. The Gemara wanted to bring a raya that yes, and it stunned Ulla. So Ulla had to be, he was stunned in his place. And Rav Ava came to exonerate or to help Ulla by switching the topic. So basically, to get away from the proofs, which I don't want to go over, but which the Gemara was establishing that money can be used for chalipin, the Gemara switched up and said, no, we're not really talking about money. We're talking about coins that have no face, meaning it's not a coin. It's not the coin that is the exchange. It's a piece of metal. In other words, and a piece of metal is like produce. It's like a property. It's not money because it's faceless. So it's not like a coin, like a quarter, a dollar, a half dollar, whatever. It's a piece of silver or a piece of copper. So the Gemara, in order to support the Amoraim who say that you cannot use money for chalipin, but in the face of an example where they did use money for chalipin, quickly amended and say, no, but we're not talking about money. We're talking about coins that have no face, so they're not dummy. So it's interesting how the Gemara answer that by again evading the subject. Go ahead.
Bring it to the modern era. It's an interesting thing, because you have that situation where if you have coins that are useless as coins because they were never truly coins, or because everything's rubbed off, it becomes the value of the metal in it, which goes up and down, right, exactly like produce and so on. But the interesting thing is that if you have a situation where the raw metal is worth substantially more than the face value of the equivalent weight coin, then all of a sudden now everything in tumult. That's why they had to change the pennies from being copper to mostly zinc. I think it's zinc, because the copper was worth so much more that people would say, forget using the penny as a penny, I'll use it as copper.
Right, absolutely. So that's how it fluctuates. So that's how the Gemara wanted to answer that question. and avoid the what would have been an embarrassment or a contradiction to Ulla and the other Amoraim, who said you can't use money for chalipin. So that's how we ended. Now, turning the page, or as it were, this new sugya. So this Tashema, the Gemara again, it's unrelenting. The Gemara still is questioning the view of Ulla and the other Amoraim that you can't use money for chalipin, and this now is going to bring other rayas to show potential that you can use it. So we're still in the throes of that discussion whether money can be used for chalipin or whether money is just outside the realm of chalipin. So that's what this Toshma is going to teach us. Now, this Toshma brings a Gemara or Mishnah in Kedushin. So the Mishnah in Kedushin, I want to take a few minutes to go over the Mishnah rather than just our Gemara here, because that Mishnah and Rashi are very incisive in what we want to discuss. So we'll start with that Toshma, and Toshma refers to the Mishnah in Kedushin. So I'm going to read from the Mishnah in Kedushin, and you don't have it in front of you unless you have a Gemara in Kedushin. It's a daf. Where are we? Chav Ches Omed Aleph. Chav Ches Omed Beis. The Mishnah in Kedushin. Hold on. Where are we? No. Chav Ches Omed Aleph. I take it back. Chav Ches Omed Aleph. Here it is. Okay. So and you can read that first part of it in the Gemara. Read along. Says the Mishnah, Kolanase domim ba'acher, kiven shezoch hazeh nischayv zeh b'chalipin. So this is a very cryptic statement in the Mishnah, and we'll see how cryptic it is in a few minutes. So the initial interpretation of these words are Kolanase domim, that if you use domim, money, as payment to buy something, ba'acher, kolanase domim ba'acher, kiven shezocher zeh. So once the seller, and we'll see, Rashi will explain clearly, once the seller takes possession of the acher, of whatever that item is, nischayev zeh b'chalipin, then the buyer takes responsibility. The buyer takes responsibility for the item being sold. Why? Because remember that in chalipin, when one party takes it, the deal is done. The other party has it. He doesn't physically has it necessarily, but he has it. In the case of money, you remember that if someone takes money, then even in a sale, the other party does not acquire. It's his, but he doesn't acquire it until he makes a kinyan, a mashicha agbal. What's the practical difference? The question always is, if once the transaction is partially done and the item gets destroyed, let's say a fire burns the item while it's sitting in the warehouse before you have a chance to take it, that's the question, who takes the loss? Is the loss the seller's loss because the buyer hasn't yet made the kinyan? Or is the loss the buyer's loss because it's automatically his? This is where there's a big difference between chalipim and damim. In the case of chalipin, once one party takes the object, the other party owns the object, even if he hasn't taken it. And if a fire goes through that warehouse, then it's his loss, the buyer's loss, because it's his. In the case of damim, where you have let's say the seller gets money, but the buyer hasn't yet made a kinyan, the seller is still responsible until the buyer physically takes it. So, says this Mishnah, the way we understand the Mishnah, if someone takes money and he buys, let's say, a chayfetz, he buys an item, given shezach hazeh, since the seller took the money, we're talking about money here. He took the money through chalipin. This chayiv zeh b'chalipin. Then the buyer who's going to get the item, he acquires the item, and it's now his responsibility if something happens to it. Why is it his item? because in Chalipin, the law is that when one party takes it, the other party is considered to having taken it, even though he didn't take it. Okay, that's a very important distinction. That's the way the Mishnah reads. That's the way we understand the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, again, now I'm in the Mishnah in Kedushim, Ketzad, what's an example of this Das Adamim? So they listen to the example. The example is, Hichlif Shor B'Para, if someone exchanges an ox for a cow, or Chamor B'Shor, or a donkey for a ox, so this is a non-monetary example, but it's an example of someone exchanging one item for another item. And when the first person makes a kinyan on the item, the second person automatically owns the item b'chalipin. So again, in our example, if someone exchanges an ox for a donkey, and let's say he takes the ox, then the donkey automatically belongs to the other guy. If the donkey is hit by a wagon and dies, who takes the loss? The buyer, because even though the donkey isn't yet in his rishus, but since chalipin means I take mine, you automatically take yours, even if it's overseas or down the road or wherever. Because of that, he is responsible. Okay.
Even if he hasn't paid yet, even if the buyer has not paid yet. If he's done a kinyan.
No, but there's no money. There's an exchange of animal for animal. So if you're giving me your ox, I'm giving you my donkey, and I take your ox and I do a mashiach and I pull it, that donkey is yours, even if it's in the barn a mile away. So you are the owner of that, and you can't get out of it, meaning something happens, you take the loss, not me, because I made the mashiach my half of the bargain. Okay, good. That's Pshat Chalipin. So the Mishnah tells us, by giving an example, a non-monetary example, the Mishnah says, but if you use money to buy something, it's considered Chalipin. That's this Mishnah. Now, you don't have it, but I'm going to read from the Rashi, because you have to hear what Rashi says. Kolanasa Damim Ba'acher, says Rashi, Shedarko L'sato B'Damim, it was their way to give money. Kishakonim chayfetz echod, when you buy a chayfetz, v'hashta sol kadatach, and now the theory is the matbeya also la'ashmi'inam, that since it's a coin, it comes to teach us kibun shezacha zeh, since this person was zacha, meaning he made the kinyan and it's his, nefchayev zeh b'chalipo, then the other person is owner, he's chayiv, he's the owner in Chalipin. Hechid, the Nasna B'Teres Chalipin, below B'Teres Damin. So what do we see from here? We see from here an example where you can use money for Chalipin. Normally, if I come to you and I say, I want to buy your cow, okay, I give you $100, I pay you. That's considered damin. That's considered money. There's no question that I gave you money and I'm buying your item. The Mishnah is telling us that he didn't say, I want to buy your cow or your item. He said, I want to make an exchange of my money for your item. So having pronounced the fact that he wants to do a kinyan chalipin for the same money that he could have bought the item, that makes it chalipin. That's what this Mishnah is telling us, that you can take money, announce that I'm doing an exchange, and now your money is chalipin and not a monetary exchange. That's the proof that this Mishnah wants to show. Wait a minute. Of course you can use money for chalipin. Look at this. So here we had Ula and Ula of the other Amoraim telling us you can't use money for chalipin. That was last week's discussion. We went back and forth, and we concluded that you can't use money for chalipin, which is why we gave that answer about a non-coin coin in order to avoid the issue. So we said, okay, so he's exchanging an item for an item which you can do in chalipin, but don't mistake that you can use money for chalipin. That was last week's Gemara. We see from the Mishnah in Kedushin, of course you can use money for chalipin. You can tell the fellow, I'm giving you money, in exchange you're giving me this item, and the proof is an ox for a donkey. There's no money involved. It's an ox for a donkey. I'm giving you an ox. You're giving me a donkey. That's classic. I mean, it's chalipin, no matter how you look at it. And there's no money involved. And that's the proof that you can use money for chalipin. You hear that? The proof for money for chalipin is a case of produce or items for items, no money involved. So Rashi is telling us.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Say what?
Yeah, it was very interesting. I looked in the back of the art scroll in the glossary. It has an interesting definition of kinyan chalipin.
Yeah.
In terms of the opening statement is, this is strict barter exchange. The whole thing is just barter.
Right.
That's the whole category. And they have a definition of something that has even barter, equal barter value or unequal barter value.
Right. Right. But and so what we're saying here is that we're bartering money for something else. We're not selling it. We're bartering damim for a chayfetz. And the Mishnah says that's perfectly okay. You can barter money for a chayfetz. And listen, not only that, but when the seller takes the money, not the item, when the seller takes the money, the other guy automatically, and that flies in the face of everything we've said in this Gemara since we started this whole sugya weeks ago. First of all, there was the whole interpretation that money can't be used for chalipin. But secondly, not only can it be used for chalipin, they say, but even if you use something for chalipin, it's the item that has to be the kinyan, not the money. Money can never be the kinyan. Here, the Mishnah is telling us right out. The seller gets the money, and all of a sudden it's chalipin, and the other guy owns the item wherever it happens to be. And the proof is shor b'para or chamor b'shor. So this is a whole different understanding of chalipin. So I just want to finish the Rashi because you'll hear in a minute how complicated this becomes. It's not that simple. He gave the money b'toras chalipin below b'toras damim. Ella ke'en shekonim b'sudar ke'en sholof ish nalo. Then it's the equivalent of someone giving a sudar or a nalo, which is from Megillus Rus, where we learn the whole inyan of chalipin. So this money is considered like a sudar or like a shoe, and therefore it's valid. So what have we learned here? We learned from this Mishnah that money can be used for chalipin. All right, it says Rashi weiter in this Mishnah. Yeah, I'm still reading from the Rashi in Kedushin. Given shezacha boha makne, since the seller is zocha, because he has the money, and he took the money, he pulled or pushed the money. With a chalipin in mind, therefore the buyer is chayiv b'onse chalipin b'kol mokum shehein, like we said before. He now is the proud owner of the item that was exchanged for the money. Imeso, if it's an animal and it dies, or nevdu olam, or if it's an item that gets burned or gets stolen. The shalom amor sheposek losses lo because it's like when the seller holds on to the sudar, the handkerchief, or azuz b'teres chalipin nikna hamekach l'lokeach b'kol makom shehu. So Rashi is impressing us time and again that money can be used for chalipin, but not only can it be used, but money can trigger chalipin. That when the money comes into the seller's hands, then the buyer automatically owns the item, whether it's a produce or whether it's an animal or no matter what. And therefore, having not even touched it or seen it, it's his, and he suffers the consequences of any damage or loss that happens to the item. So, again, the Mishnah is clear, and Rashi couldn't be clearer. Go ahead, Jay.
So where do we learn out this automatic thing that happens? What's the source of the automatic?
That's from Rus, because in Rus it says that when the person when he gave the shoe, then automatically the kinyan was made. That's over there. It's from the pasuk. That the transference of the shoe is what made the kinyan happen, regardless of what happens on the other side. Meaning, it's a half a transaction, but it's the half of the transaction that triggers the other half of the transaction.
But there's no exception to that, I guess, right?
No,
Automatic always happens.
right, as opposed to a sale, where giving the money is only half the transaction. The other guy owns it, but he's not responsible for it until he actually makes the Mashiach or the Hagbo or the Kinyan. So in Damim, it's not reciprocal. In Chalipin, it's automatically reciprocal that the other side becomes the owner, regardless whether he picks it up or doesn't pick it up or whatever.
Right.
Okay, so that's the source. Now, so now Rashi continues there in Kedushin. The example is exchanging a shor for a para. Hichlif shor b'para, says Rashi, given shemoshach bala para as a shor, since the owner of the para of the cow made a mashicha on the shore, nikdas para lokeach. The cow automatically is acquired by the lokeach. Makol makom shehu. It might be a mile away. It could be a continent away. Va'onsa alav, and the responsibility for that animal is his if something happens. Ugemara Paroch. Now, okay, so Rashi is getting ahead of us a little bit because Rashi is saying Ugemara Paroch, and the Gemara asks the question, which we'll see in a minute. My Ketzad. What's the Ketzad? Rashi, the Gemara, the Mishnah says, Ketzad. Example. So now Rashi says, my Ketzad. What's the Ketzad? Also Ashmin in the Matbeya Nasa Chalipin. Since the Mishnah wants to come to tell us that Matbeya Nasa Chalipin Sha'afal Pi Shebetoras Domin Kaimalon, even though it's Betoras Domin Kaimalon, we learned in here in our Gemara in the Hazor, the Mos Eina Kone and the Mashikas Hameka. Wait a minute, we learned something different here in Hazor. We learned that Mos Eina Konos, that money cannot be a Kone, and the Mashikas Hameka. Only the Mashiach of the item. Ki yavina nela b'teres kinyan suda. Ki sudahu lelabista ketzad hechlef mos b'para. So Rashi is saying ketzad as an example, but wait a minute. The source of the kinyan we learned from what we learned here in Hazov, and there the Gemara says, right? Because until now, what does the Gemara say? That mos ain't a kindness. Everybody and his uncle, Ula, Rav Abba, everybody says Mos ain't a konos, that you can't be koina. And the Mashiach Hameka, only the Mashiach of the item itself, right? That makes the kinyan. So Ketzad. So how can that be? Rashi is asking what the Ketzad means. The Ketzad gives us an example of something that isn't on par with what the Mishnah is telling us. The Mishnah is telling us that Domim makes Chalipin, and the example is a cow for a para. What does a cow for a para have to do with Domim? What does it have to do with taking money and exchanging it? Our whole discussion for weeks has been produce, absolutely Chalipin, right? Money, no. And here you want to tell me money makes Chalipin, and the raya, the proof is because produce can be traded for produce. I mean, that's where you're coming from. Where you're coming to tell us. That's what we have to answer. Okay, so that's what we have to answer. Okay, so now let me just say the beginning of the Gemara, then we'll go back to our Gemara here in Bava Metzia. So the Gemara in Kedushin, and on this Mishnah, you can take a look at it later. Chalipin ma'niu. So the Gemara asks Akasha Chalipin ma'niu. What is this that the Mishnah is telling us about Chalipin? What kind of object is the Mishnah telling us that you can exchange? Says the Gemara, Matbeya. We're talking about a dummy. We're talking about money. Matbeya, money. Shema mina, matbeya nasa chalipin. Says the Gemara conclusively, since the Mishnah is talking about domim, meaning money, matbeya, it's a proof that what? Matbeya nasa chalipin. So now we have a proof from a Mishnah in Kedushin, which is contradicted by a list of Amoron. Now remember, this is a Mishnah. The Mishnah came first. So the Mishnah is the black letter law. Comes the Amoraim, Ula and Rabba and others, and they say, you can't use money for chalipin. What do you mean? There's a Beferish Mishnah. You can't, Amoraim can't make it up. They can't come if there's an ambiguity and they want to interpret the ambiguity. Then we say that the later the generation, the closer we come to us, that's where the halacha is. In other words, when you go from the Mishnah to the Gemara, and the Gemara is clarifying the Mishnah, then it's the Gemara we follow. Remember, there was no Shulchan Aruch there. So they said, what's the halacha? Everyone, what's the halacha? The halacha is, since the Gemara conclusively says, Ein mos nasa chalipin, it can't be. But that's only when there's a machlokes, and the machlokes becomes clarified. There's no machlokes here. There's a black letter law Mishnah in Kedushin that says kalanasa damim ba'acher kimachazachazeh neschayev b'chalipin. That if you take money and you exchange it for something else b'chalipin, 100% kosher. So there's no ambiguity here. So what's pshat in all these Amoraim who are saying Ein damim nasa chalipin? Last week we had this whole discussion, and we had to save face. Remember, if you go back to last week's discussion, Rav Abba had to. Ula was stunned because the Gemara brought a raya against him, and he had no answer. Came Rav Abba and said, "No, Ula, you're really right, because we're talking about faceless coins, not domim coins." So he justified the Gemara according to Ula. But wait a minute. You're taking Ula, and you're saying Ula is right, Ula and the others, Ula is right, Domin ein nasa chalipin, because and that Gemara that was against that Gemara that was opposite to Ula is talking about produce, so it's safe face. But what about the Mishnah in the Kedushin? We just learned this morning a Mishnah in Kedushin. You can't twist this. It says Domim zochazem eschayim b'chalipin. So right now we're at a loss. We have a Beferish Mishnah in Kedushin that says Domim can be used for Chalipin. How can everybody else later on come and say, oh no, there's an ambiguity and we're going to interpret it differently? There is no ambiguity at all. It's clear that money can be used for Chalipin. That's the Toshma, that's the Kasha. All right, so that's the answer. So now I'm going to put the Gemara Kedushin down for a minute, because we're going to look at our Gemara together, and we're going to go from there and try to understand what is really going on here, because this is really a fascinating study in the Gemara and trying to understand. Now, remember one thing, and last week was a classic example. Do you remember last week we had the discussion about whether or not you can make a transfer with a money changer if you don't have the money in your hand? So the Gemara went back and forth. Yes, you can make the exchange only if you have it in your house. If you have it in your house, the exchange happens and there's no ribbis. Remember, we started talking about ribbis, and ribbis is an integral part of this discussion, but not right now. So last week we said, if the money is in your house and you tell the money changer, please exchange these coins for me, I got to feed my workers, but I have the money, I'm just waiting to get the key to open it up. Says the Gemara, that's not ribbis, because you're giving him more than what you are borrowing, what you're taking. So the Gemara says that's not ribbis, because what you're doing is it's an exchange, and an exchange with what he has and what you has can't be ribbis. If you borrow from him and pay him back more than you borrowed, that's ribbis. But if you're exchanging by chalipin, you can't have ribbis. It's not an exact exchange, because there you're getting a coin and a coin. The Tarot says that's okay, because you can give him more, and it's not ribbis in chalipin. All right, that's the law. Okay, so the Gemara there said, yeah, but wait a minute. But if you don't have it, says the Gemara there, then you're in trouble, because if you don't have it and you have to get it from somewhere else, then it's considered a loan. Now you're repaying him more than you took. That's ribbis. Now you're in trouble with ribbis. So the Gemara wanted to give an example. Wait a minute, no. We're not talking about money. We're talking about faceless coins that have a value. That's produce. Produce you can exchange. There's no ribbis and there's only ribbis and domim. There's not ribbis in chalipin. That's the law, right? So that's how we ended this Gemara. Now we're coming to say that if a person takes actual money, says that Mishnah in Kedushin, and makes the exchange, it is chalipin. So and forget about ribbis. We're not talking about ribbis. There would be no ribbis, of course, but it is chalipin. That goes against everything we've said till now. Till now, we've gone back and forth and back and forth. Now, the point that I wanted to make is that the Gemara, and we said that this is a legitimate, because this is how they learned, is that, remember we have the case of the threshing floor. Wait a minute, he's on the threshing floor, and he wants to make the exchange. So you see that you can do it. Says the Gemara, it's not his threshing floor, he was living somewhere else. Again, the Gemara gave terutzim for everything in order to avoid head-on a proof against these Amoraim. So we kind of discussed it and chuckled a little bit, that you see how the Gemara twists and turns. This is an exercise in understanding. The Gemara twists and turns to find every which way that there should not be ribbis on the one hand, or chalipin with money on the other hand. We're faced with numerous examples of where you can use chalipin, but it's like the Gemara slips out of that hole and says, no, you can't. Now, this morning, we're bringing a Beferish Mishnah that says money is chalipin. How are you going to twist out of this? That's the point I want to make, because now we're going to see how the Gemara slips out of this as well. We're still not finished. The Gemara is still twisting and turning to reach a conclusion that money cannot be used for chalipin. So for everybody who's thinking about this, it's kind of an interesting thought, because if you have an open discussion, then you say, oh, there's a raya from here that money is b'chalipin, and a raya from here that money is not b'chalipin. So what do? Okay, we're going to give answers. But the Gemara wants to have a predisposed answer to tell us that money can't be used by chalipin. That's how the Gemara wants to come out. It wants to come out with that. Says the Gemara again and again, but you can't come out with that because we have a place where it is. So the Gemara is constantly scrambling to find an answer, because at the end of the day, we kind of want the answer to be that domim can't be used by chalipin. That's what we want. But the Gemara keeps finding ways to show that it is. Again, this is the beauty of the Gemara, is that's what Shakla V'Tarya is. You know, it's not just a question and answer and we move on. It's a question and answer. It's a question on the answer. It's an answer and then another question on the answer. It's never ending. So sometimes, like last week, we said Shema Mina. Okay, it's proof positive. Yeah, till this week. Other times we say Teku. We give up. We can't find an answer. Let Mashiach give us the answer, because we didn't get the answer we wanted. We wanted an answer that told us money can't be made of chalipin, but we find an example yet somewhere else where it is b'chalipin. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? So again, this is a microcosm of an example of how the Gemara opens our minds to think that the exchange back and forth in the Mishnah between the Amoraim is a fascinating discussion, and somewhere along the line, the Gemara has to come to a conclusion. Sometimes the conclusion is question mark, no conclusion, and sometimes the Gemara does conclude. Last week we concluded Shema Mino Ein Domim Nasa Chalipin, and I said, okay, we're closing our books and we're going to move on. But wait a minute, there's always next week. Well, here we are in next week, and we see a Mishnah that tells us no way, no how. It's clear from the Mishnah that domim nasa b'chalipin, the money makes chalipah. What are you going to do? You can't tell me that the Amoraim are arguing about this. It's not ambiguous. Okay, I said all of this. Now we're going to turn the page and see why I'm not right. Okay, now we're going to see it. All right, so let's look at the Gemara. Bottom of the Gemara, we're just going to repeat what we just said in the Mishnah. Toshma, says that the Mishnah in Kedushin, right? Frank the Gemara here, that's the Gemara in Kedushin I read. What is it? What does it mean? Nasa domim ba'acher, and for the Gemara, matbeya. It means coin. Ushmamina matbeya nasa chalipin. So, and we see from this that matbeya nasa chalipin. Okay, that's what I repeated from the Gemara in Kedushin. Okay, now, Omar Rabbi Yehuda. Now, the bottom line, we're going to turn to Mem Vav and Medes. Omar Rabbi Yehuda, comes Rabbi Yehuda and says, wait a minute, you've got it wrong. The way you interpreted the Mishnah is not correct. Why? Hachi ka'amar. This is what the Mishnah says. The Gemara just got through saying that when it said, means matbeya, comes Rabbi Yehuda and says, no, it doesn't. Says the top line of Mem Vav Medes, Kol Hanishum Domim Ba'acher. Okay, the language of the Mishnah was Kol Anase Domim Ba'acher. Rabbi Yehuda says that's not what it means. It doesn't mean Nase Domim, someone who takes money and buys something. It means Kol Hanishum Domim Ba'acher. Any addition means to appraise or to evaluate. Anybody who evaluates domim ba'acher. So how is that different? Take a look at Rashi, the top Rashi on Mem Vav Medes. Kol hanishim domim ba'acher, kol shuragilim loshum oso, kishenosnim osno domim. Okay, you're going to give me an item, and you're going to want to exchange it for another item. How do I know how much that item is worth? If I give you money and the money says on the face of it $1, right? $1 is a coin, $1. I know that's $1. But if you give me an item that is not a coin, how do I know it's $1? How do I know that item is $1? I have to go and appraise it. I've got to go to an appraiser who will tell me this item is $1. You can exchange it for that item, which is also worth $1. Says Rabbi Yehuda, Kol anishim domim ba'acher, anybody who in fact appraises an item, right? Says Rashi, Kol shiragilim osam osa kishenosan osno domim ba'acher, daham kol metaltalim, meaning any item, any movable item, in Bo Adam, Moses Domim Bechefetz Acher, someone wants to give money for the Chefetz, Darken L'Shumam Bekama Yenasalo. It is our custom to evaluate, to appraise the Shumam, to appraise how much he should give him. Because we don't know, for instance, the donkey and the ox. We want to exchange them. How do we know they're equal value? We have to appraise. Oh, the ox is worth $100. The donkey's worth $100. That's a valid exchange. So what is Rabbi Yehuda doing? Rabbi Yehuda once again is answering the question and saying, no, this Mishnah doesn't prove that you can use damim bechalipin because it's not talking about money. It's talking about appraising something for money. In other words, you appraise it to see what it's worth. The damim isn't the actual money. The damim is the appraisal. So you're going to appraise this item to see what it's worth in money. And then you know that it's worth $100 in money, but it isn't money, it's an ox. Now I can trade it for the donkey that was also, we know, $100. So what has Rabbi Yehuda done? Rabbi Yehuda has changed the entire meaning of the Mishnah, and we no longer have a kasha on Ula. In other words, the Amoraim who were taking the position that Ein Kesef B'chalipin, they're right. Of course, Ein Kesef B'chalipin. The Mishnah isn't talking about money. Mishnah is talking about appraisals. An appraisal isn't money. What you're doing is you appraise it to understand how much it's worth in money, but it's not the money, right? We see the difference. So if it's not the money, we no longer have a raya from the Mishnah that you can use a coin for chalipin. So now we've taken the whole discussion, we've turned it on its ear again, and we're back to square one. Ein damim nasa b'chalipin. You can't use money for chalipin. The Mishnah doesn't say you can use money. The Mishnah says you can take an item and appraise it for money to see how much it's worth, but it's still an item. And as long as it's an item for an item, that's okay. But money for an item? No, that you can't do. Now we understand why Ola and all of the Maroim were saying Ein Dam Nasa B'Chalipin, because they didn't find a stira from this Mishnah. According to Rabbi Yehuda, this Mishnah doesn't even talk about money. It talks about appraisals. Again, you see the slippery, slippery, I use that word, but you see how the Gemara is going back now and saying that now, so Kivin Shezacha Zen is Chayav Ze B'Chalipin. Since this person is Zacha, then it's Chayav B'Chalipin. How do we know that Rabbi Yehuda is right? How do we know Rabbi Yehuda didn't make it up? What do you mean evaluation? It says Domim. Says the Gemara, second line, Hochinam Mistabra, Rabbi Yehuda is probably right. Why? Midiktani Seifa. What's the Seifa of the Mishnah which I read? Ketzat, what's an example of the ratio of exchanging, quote, money or the equivalence of money? Hichlif shor b'para or chamor b'shor. If someone exchanges shor b'para or chamor b'shor, shema mina. Why would the Mishnah go from a discussion of money to a discussion of exchanging a shor and a par, or a chamor b'par? That's the question I asked in the beginning. What's the connection? Carrot says, you know what the connection is? We weren't talking about money in the first place. We were talking about an appraisal of an item. So if you're appraising one item for another, then Kesad, what's an example of appraising one item for another? Shor b'par, or chamor b'par. Now the Mishnah makes perfect sense, because the Seifa is modifying the Reisha, and since the Seifa is talking about non-monetary exchanges, the Reisha has to be talking about non-monetary exchange, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda is right that when it says damim, it doesn't mean money, it means appraising as if it were money, so we understand the value. So once again, it's kind of, the Mishnah has slipped out of the noose. Here we thought from the Mishnah we're about to give 100% proof that money can be used for chalipin. Said Rabbi Yehuda, no. Go ahead, Jay.
But the appraisal is not the end of the story. They're appraising it because they want to have an exchange or chalipin, whatever they want to do.
You're right.
Why do you change?
No. Jay, you just said it. You're appraising it. Here's what an appraisal is. Okay, let me give you an example. I have an item. I don't know how much it is. I go to an appraiser translates it into money, and then he pulls it back out of money because he says, you're not transacting money, you just wanted to know how much it was worth. I'm telling you it's worth because coin money is the gold standard of all transactions. So you take an item, how much is it worth? You're not going to tell me, oh, a cow is worth a tractor. What does that tell me? Oh, a cow is worth $100. Now I know, because $100 that's out there. Now, what is the other animal worth? Also $100. So we can trade, but if you're going to tell me that my cow is the worth of a tractor and I want to trade it for an ox, what have you told me? You've not told, I don't know what a tractor is worth. So you have to have Dumim as the arbitrary adjudicator, if you will, of items. So you're just saying, the Mishnah is not telling us that you can trade money for an item. The Mishnah is telling us that you can use money as an adjudicator for value, but the trade is between the value, the item, and the item, not the money.
But they changed
when the Mishnah said, dummy, you can trade money for an item, which means money can be used for chalipin. So Rabbi Yehuda says, you got it wrong. It's not money we're trading, it's an item with using money as the evaluator. And the proof that I'm right, because the Sefer of the Mishnah gives us, what's an example of what I'm talking about? Shor b'chamor. There's no money involved in a shor b'chamor, because simply you got an evaluation of the shor, an evaluation of the chamor, and you were told they're about, let's say 100 each. Good, we'll make a swap. So once again, there's no raya that money is used for chalipin, because it's not money we're talking about, it's only movable items. whether it's a cow or whether it's, again, now we're gonna get into a whole different story
They
of whether
should
it
have-
has to be a chayfetz, a utensil, or it can be like produce.
But-
A basket full of grapefruits is not a utensil, but it is a movable item. Go ahead, Jay.
But the appraisal is, I mean, the Mishnah, they could have written the word appraisal. The fact that they're talking dumbin really says that it doesn't mean that it's an appraisal. How can you throw in appraisal as another way to get out of the corner that you're in?
You're 100% right, Jay. That's again what I'm trying to give across is that what you see, it's almost like a sleight of hand. Of course, it says dumbin. So on the face of it, there's a whole Mishnah in Kedushin that interprets it to mean money. You saw what Rashi said. Rashi said it means money. It's a raya. You can use money for chalipin, a whole 9 yards. And then we turn the thing. We pull the rug out. Rabbi Yehuda says, no. What you thought you saw, that's an apparition. You didn't see it because dumbin doesn't mean dumbin. It means appraisal. You're right to ask, where do they come from? But again, in his wisdom, Rabbi Yehuda came back and said, because again, we want to come to a conclusion that money can't be used for chalipin. So we're doing everything we can to find an excuse to say, oh no, when you saw money, it didn't mean money. It meant appraising for money. Again, if the outcome is we want to reach a conclusion that money can't be used for chalipin, we're going to find every which way to reach that conclusion. In this case, Rabbi Yehuda says, what you thought you saw, you didn't see. Because the Mishnah says damin, but it doesn't mean damin.
In effect, they made it up.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can.
I mean, it's not,
If
it doesn't belong there. I mean, it has nothing to do with the actual story that you're trying to do, bartering or whatever you want to call it.
Right. So
They substitute the substance of the discussion to bring in something else.
right. So it would have been
Doesn't make sense.
extremely interesting to be sitting in the Beis Medrash at the table of Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda is learning this to his Talmidim, and he says, Kol anishim damim. The Mishnah doesn't mean, and you say there, you raise your hand and say, Rabbi Yehuda, how it says damim. Yehuda says it says damim, but it doesn't mean damim. It means nishum damim. It means
I would have asked
raising for money.
If I would have brought that up in the base of Medrash, I'd be on the outside saying, "Hey, I've got an answer for you.
Well, listen.
Call it appraisals."
I'm going to tell you this. When I was in yeshiva,
Very clever.
when I was in yeshiva, there were, I mean, tremendous bachrim. One of them would sit in front of the Rosh Yeshiva and they'd argue a point. You hear the argument back and forth. The Rosh Yeshiva is making a point. The bacher is going, how can you say that? It's totally not what the Gemara is. And the heavens are opening up because there is this Geshrei in the Beis Medrash. It doesn't say it. How can you possibly learn Pshat this way? And I'm thinking to myself, and by the way, that Talmud who was arguing with the Rosh Yeshiva is today the Rosh Yeshiva. He's today the Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva, but back in the day, he was a brilliant fellow. Back in the day, he was making a tremendous point to his Rebbe. How can you say this? I mean, we're not at that. Okay, I'm just saying to you, Jay. Right, the Mishnah, the Heilige Mishnah, tells us. It's not ambiguous. And the Gemara asked, mind you, what does it mean? Matbeya. That when it says domim, it means a coin. You can't get clearer than that. Okay, fine. Comes Rabbi Yehuda, the Talmud, and he says, Mishnah, you said domim, and someone is saying matbeya. I'm telling you it's wrong. It's not a matbeya. It's an appraisal. It's a nishum. Go prove it. I mean, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that when something is unambiguous, you can't argue on it. This looked unambiguous.
Right.
Comes Rabbi Yehuda and says, no, you're mistaken. It is ambiguous. Because when it says coin, it doesn't mean coin. It doesn't mean coin. I mean, what if you're staring, I'm staring at you and you're telling me it's raining and I see that it's not raining? How can you say it? So anyway, my point being that Rabbi Yehuda comes along and Rabbi Yehuda says that you cannot necessarily take it at face value because there's a meaning in the Mishnah. Now we say, Elu Elu, I mean, Rabbi Yehuda was one of the great Amoraim. How could you argue with Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda comes and says a shita. Look, we have arguments, Shim, Shama, Hillel, Avaya, Rava. I mean, you name it. They both can't be right. Someone is right, someone is not right or less right. How can you do that? So we have to accept it in the derech of learning that our arguments L'Shem Shemayim that we don't necessarily now you can take a position. You can say, I like that view, because to me that view is unambiguous. I understand that, I'll accept that. So when Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says, what you think is the right view isn't quite the right view, so you're going to say, but with all due respect, Rabbi Yehuda, I don't understand how you come along and say that. How can you come along and take the word damim and interpret it differently than what we commonly understand damim? Damim is money. And Gemara said, matbeya, it's money. And that would prove that a coin can be used for chalipin. Rabbi Yehuda says, with all due respect, money is not money. What you think means money means, yes, it's money, but you are praising an item for money, using money not as the noun, but using money as the adjective, that the adjective is going to describe this chayfetz as to what it's worth. Not that you're actually dealing with the $100, but you're going to take the chayfetz and say, this chayfetz is worth damim. How much money? $100. So he's not totally tearing apart the word damim. He's just taking the word damim and saying it's a modifier, not a noun.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, again, we're hammering on this point because this is another example from what we said last week. We're about to come to a conclusion that money can be used for chalipin, and all of a sudden, Rabbi Yehuda pulls out the rug and he says, no, money cannot be used for chalipin. It is used for an evaluation. And the proof, says Rabbi Yehuda, is the Mishnah itself. Because the Mishnah says, Ketzad, what's an example of damim? Tichlif shor b'para, or chamor b'shor. Wait a minute, you're going to exchange a shor b'para, and that's an example of money? How do you, that's not money, that's two items. Says Rabbi Yehuda, that's my point. My point is that was never intended to be damim. It was intended to be an item that you extrapolate its worth in damim. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, when you think about how this Gemara is discussing it, it's a continuation of last week's thinking that we're going to find every which way to prove that money cannot be used for chalipin, even when it stares us in the face. Okay, so let's just go a step further, because we spent an enormous amount of time on this Mishnah and Gemara, but you have to really understand, because that's the key to everything. Okay. Now, the Gemara asks one other question that we want to get to. So we thought it was money, and when we thought it was money, we gave an example of shor b'para. Says Rabbi Yehuda, it's not money, and my proof is shor b'para. So what's the next obvious question? Well, in your havamina, right? We started out this morning's discussion by saying that the Mishnah says that when it says b'damim, it means matbeya. If it really means matbeya, my kesad, then what's the proof? The proof that it's money is because you're going to exchange a shor b'chamor. That makes no sense. You're going to tell me that it's money, and therefore money can be used for chalipin. And you know how I'm going to prove it? Because you're going to exchange a shor b'chamor. I'll look at you and say, what are you out of your mind? You want to tell me you can use money for chalipin, money, real money, and you're going to give me an example of a non-monetary transaction. That makes no sense. So the Gemara asks, "My sel kedata miikora matbeya mai is my ketzad." So what's the ketzad then? The comparison of shor chamor to prove money is chalipin is like the star and the moon and the sun. They're two different, totally different environments. And for the Gemara, so now the Gemara is going to answer that question. Hachik Omar. You know what this, okay, this is a whole, it's opening up a venue that we're going to have to really get into next week. Hachik Omar, you know what the proof is? Upeira nama of the Chalipin. All right, so let's set the stage. The pasuk in Rus that tells us about Chalipin is about a shoe, a noal. What is a shoe? We've said this many times before. A shoe is a utensil, right? Like a cup, like a saucer, like a pot. It's a utensil. The Gemara is telling us, or the Mishnah is telling us as follows. You think that there are two types of items in the world. There's noal, and then there is damim. There's a utensil, and then there's money. No, there's not. There is a third item in the world that is not a utensil and not damim. What is that? Produce. Anything that is a metaltalin, not karka, meaning not land. Anything that is a movable item that is not money and is not a noal, a utensil, is called metaltalin, i.e. produce. I mean, produce is an example, but the Gemara uses produce as the example of metaltalin. So there are three distinct categories. There's money, there's noal, utensil, and then there's metaltalin. Says the Gemara, listen to this. We just asked a question. According to the earlier interpretation of the Mishnah, that it means damim, what example are you giving me about shor b'chamor has nothing to do with money? Answer, you're right. But it does have to do with metaltalin and wants to teach us a non-related point that you can use metaltalin for chalipin, not damim. No, damim is off the table. But you don't have to use a utensil for chalipin. You can use this metzias that we call metaltalin. That's what the Gemara says the Mishnah is teaching us. How do you mean? How do you mean? Hold on a second. I think my battery was ran low because my wire came out. Second. Okay, got it. So this is the way you have to read the Mishnah. In other words, it says that Mishnah there said what? Right? You exchange damim, meaning real money, because now we're interpreting it the way we started in the beginning. You're interpreting Ketzad, what's an example of money exchanged for something else? Now we know we're not talking about money anymore. We're talking about an item. But the item we thought we're talking about is the utensil. And for the Gemara, hachi kamar, upeire namna of a chalipin, that you can use a peire, meaning a movable, a metaltalin for chalipin. How do you know? Ketzad hichlif shor b'para chamor b'shor. Because if you exchange a shor b'para or a chamor b'shor, which is not money, and it's not a utensil, an ox and a chamor are not utensils. They are metaltalin. They're movable items, just like a barrel of grapefruit or a barrel of nails, whatever you want to call it. That's the chiddush of the Mishnah. So now we have yet another tremendous interpretation of this Mishnah that originally we thought the Mishnah is talking about money. And the Mishnah said, and I'll prove it to you, because it says, Hichlef Shor B'Chamor. Says Rabbi Yehuda, wait a minute, that makes no sense. The Mishnah doesn't mean money. The Mishnah means you're doing an appraisal for money. So you're appraising something for money and you're making an exchange. But at that point, I'm still thinking utensil, because that's the source of chalipin. Comes the Mishnah, Ketzad. You know what the example is? Nothing to do with a chayfetz, with a utensil. It has to do with a movable. So the chiddush of this Mishnah, the way we see it now, TBD, but the way we see it now is that the Mishnah is not talking about money. It's talking about appraising something for money. And the proof is because we're transferring two non-monetary items. Correct, the Gemara, then what did the Havamina of the Mishnah mean when it says actual money? The answer is, it didn't mean money there either, but it didn't mean a utensil. They wanted to show us that the third category of produce, meaning movables, can also be used for chalipin. So you have two different ways of looking at this Mishnah. The original way where it meant damim, money, and then it meant chalipin. Or you say, no, it was never money, it was really what? It was appraising. And still, we're trading two items, except that in the one way of looking at it, the chiddush is that you don't need a utensil to make chalipin, even though that's the source of the pasuk, but you can use two movables, and that's going to be important because now, again, when we continue the Gemara, now we're going to be looking at this whole union of movables, because in our mind, chalipin means a utensil, some kind of utensil, because that's what the pasuk says. So now Rabbi Yehuda is coming to tell us, no, that it's not money and it's not utensil, but it's metaltalin. And we're going to see how that plays into it. But again, we've had these questions back and forth, but you see, again, the objective of the Gemara is to try to get to an answer. And every time we get to an answer that a damim is not metaltalin, we find another source that slugs it up. But then we have to find a way of slugging that up and saying, no, that's not a proof, because the lashon is so and so, and like you asked Jay and others, but it says damim. Well, what are you going to argue? That's why I say you have to sit at the table of Rabbi Yehuda, and you have to understand what Rabbi Yehuda is telling you when he's looking you in the face and says, Jay, damim doesn't mean damim. Damim means nishum. It means appraisal. So what are you going to argue with Rabbi Yehuda? Where does it say? That's pshat. That's the pshat. That's what reminds me of the machlekes between Rebbe and Talmud, is that the Rebbe is defending, the Gemara, and the Talmud saying, how could you defend the Gemara? It doesn't say so. So again, you have to have the deeper understanding. So let's just look at one more Rashi. Hachiname mistabra, like 4 lines into the narrows. The we're not talking about a matbeya. The Doni Sefer, because the Sefer says Ketzev Hichel Shor B'Para, so it can't be B'Matbeya. So Hachik Oma Opera Nami, call him a Taltalin, Afa Pisha Ein a Kli. Then when it says Pera, it means also Pera. That it means all movables, even though she ain't a Kli of the Chalipin. You still can make Chalipin with something that's not a Kli. Ketzad V'Achiv Parashinullah Kala Oised Domin Ba'acher. The Hanumat someone who takes the money and uses it for an evaluation. Im nosnu b'teiros chalipin kim shezoch hazeh neschayv zeh b'chalipin. Keisat chalipin, umau chalipin. What is an example of chalipin? Machlif shor b'para. Someone exchanges a shor b'para, v'ashminan agav urcha b'seifa. The pera also chalipin. So from the words of trading chamor b'shara, we learn out that peras, produce, not utensils, can be used for chalipin. Hichlef shor b'para gosin and longer sin and basar shor. So this is a side issue. Is the example was shor b'para, an ox for a cow. We could have said the meat of the cow for the ox, right? We could have said, no, it wasn't an actual cow. It was the shechted the cow, and now you have meat, and you're transferring the meat of the cow for the ox. That would have been the same thing, so to speak, because neither of them are utensils. They're all produce. They're all items, metaltalin. So Rashi just says that we would rather compare the one live animal to the other, and not, there are other places where they were goyres, no, basar b'shor, that they traded meat for the shore. The nafkamina is in the words, not in the meaning, because either way, we're talking about produce or nepaltalin. Neither shore nor basar is a utensil. They're all items of food. A food is not a utensil. So it doesn't have an effect on the underlying understanding. It's just the girsa. Okay, so here, this is where we're stopping, and we'll have to pick up and just repeat this because we're not finished. Notwithstanding that the Gemara gave us a wonderful answer as to what it is, now we're going to see that this answer is kind of, on a very narrow base, because there's a machlekes in the Gemara which will impact this. So we'll stop here a moment on the base. But again, this is a tremendous insight, as we had said repeatedly, in understanding the thinking of the Gemara, and that's what makes Gemara so fascinating, is that it's not just what you see in front of you. You read it, you say, okay, I get it. Damim is damim, and damim nasa chalipin. And if you wouldn't have had Rabbi Yehuda to give us a different interpretation, we would have just left it there. That's why we have the great Rabbi Yehuda who comes along and says, damim is not damim. It says damim, but it doesn't mean damim. So for those of us, and many of us who have learned other mesechtas or other subject matter, you see time and time again is how the Gemara operates, that the Gemara goes back and forth. Sometimes it leaves well enough alone. And so, you're right, it's damim, let's move on. But in many other cases, and I'm using damim as an example, but in many other cases, it says, you know what, it says damim, but it's not damim, it means something else. Now we'll move on. So for all of us who are left with ambiguities every time we learn, which is all of us, because we all learn and we all come away and say, what's Pshat like Gemara? What does the Gemara really mean? The answer is, that's why we have, thankfully, we have Rashi and Taisus and even the Rishonim later, who help us understand the word of the Gemara. Because from the word of the Gemara, you can come away with one distinct idea, and it's only because you learned Rashi or Taisus, or even Machlekes Rashi and Taisus. And then you have one of the Rishonim who said, this is the Machlekes. That's how we learn. That's how we come at the end and say, okay, I've learned Shas. I understand. I got to start again because the whole thing is, we got to go again. We didn't finish. We didn't really understand what we learned. That's where we start again. And that's Pshat with Daf Yomi, but it also is in our own learning. That's why I said it when we started Bava Metzia quite some time ago. I said many of us in our youth, when we were maybe in day school, yeshiva, so very often the first Masechta that's learned is Shnai Machzim B'Talis or Elam Metzias, because those are things that younger children can sink their teeth into. They can understand what it means to be a Metzia, and we have discussion. I said that here we are, we're all a little bit more mature in our learning. We're going to learn it for the first time, because what you learned in grade school isn't what you're going to learn here. In grade school, we came away with, who in grade school, I can't even imagine, because I didn't learn Hazov as a young boy. We learned Elam Metzias, we learned Hamafkid, and then we went to something else. We didn't learn Hazov. So I've learned Hazov, but not as a child. So if I would have learned Hazov, and I would have learned as a, 10-year-old, 11, 12, whatever it is, I would have learned this Mishnah, this Gemara, it would have blown my mind. I didn't understand. We read what we read. It says damim. What are you telling me? Money is money. I understand damim. I know what the word means. You're going to start telling me damim doesn't mean damim. It means appraisal. And the example is a shar b'chamar. Forget it. I don't get it. So maybe it was, I don't remember all the shilas that we had in Elam Metzias. Probably had plenty of shilas then too. But this is a wonderful example of how you take what seems to be on the face of it a terrific understanding of the Gemara, a great kasha, and you walk away. I'm walking away and saying everything I understood about the Mishnah, forget about it. Nothing that I thought was there. The Gemara gave me, now I have something else to think about. So that's what I'll leave you with. Mitzvah Hashem, next week, we're going to pick up on this thing. And this is what's fascinating about this whole Gemara is that every week there's a twist and turn, which either negates or amplifies what we learned the week before. So Mitzvah Hashem, next week we'll pick up on.
When we learn.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Gemara,
Thank you.
when we learn